FullMetalTastic.
What it do, YouTube? It's your boy FullMetalTastic, back at like a crack at it. Always here like a bad habit. How you live, how you feeling, how you feeling, how you living. Shout out to the naysayers. Shout out to the haters. Shout out to the Lulus, the couple schools miss. I said I'm hot. I'm on fire. I'm never missing. Shout out to the hidden one. One of the few Assassin's Creed content creators that I follow. Cool guy. We're getting blessed, right? I waited. I wanted to you know, wait until I was finished with work for the week. Be like, I bet let me just, you know, let me get into this video. Let me dive into it. Let me dissect some things, right? And you know, see what we gonna get here. I don't know which one's gonna be released first, but this is probably gonna be released after my reaction to the story trailer. But yeah, let's get into it.
So I was fortunate enough to get the chance to play Assassin's Creed Shadows early. Now when I say early, I don't mean the full game, of course. I got to spend about 4 hours with it.
I just want to show y'all this before y'all say something in the comments, right? Hold on, we're gonna put my camera right there for just 1 second, right?
And yes, 4 hours is not a ton of time for a big
work in progress
such as this.
Right,
but regardless, cool. I'm just grateful for the opportunity. Now, if you've been watching me for a while, you know I always try to speak on things in truth, whether it's positive or negative. And some of it has definitely got me in some shit. So I'm here to give you my completely honest early thoughts on Assassin's Creed Shadows from the 4 hours.
I love when he talks with his commentary because he's just unapologetically himself.
If I thought some parts of this game were bad, I'll straight up say it's bad. And if I think some parts are good, you'll hear that too. Of course, since we only had 4 hours, there was a lot I could get done in that time frame. So I did try my best.
Why did I say walking? Because he was walking.
Only 4 hours. Now, just some context before I get into it. My expectations going into this 4-hour preview event would probably be quite different compared to a lot of other people who, let's say, went in with the expectation of wanting to play a great open world Assassin's Creed game, or just a great open world game in general. So in terms of the Assassin's Creed IP, I will be judging parts of it based on that. And I'll also be comparing a lot of things to past Assassin's Creed RPG games. And so my overall thoughts are quite positive, to be fair. Now, I do have to note that the build I played on was a work in progress build, and it was not entirely representative of the final experience. This was also played through a remote desktop application, so the quality I saw was compressed, and the FPS was not what it would normally be, but hopefully the footage.
Apparently, I was reading, apparently this build was the one that was supposed to be released in November. So take that with a grain of salt, right?
It looks okay for you to see. Of course, when I have the full game in my hands, it's going to be 4K 60 plus FPS and just looking beautiful as ever. So bear all of that in mind. Anyway, as always, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you have not already. I literally just hit 100,000 subscribers a few days ago as I've been making this video. So thank you so much for that. And do be on the lookout for something special. So yeah, let's get into my early thoughts on Assassin's Creed Shadows.
Let's hear 'em. Story mode.
Now, straight off the bat, in terms of the story, we were able to play the entire prologue in this preview event, but I'm not able to show or talk about what happens for spoiler purposes, of course. But what I will say, and I think I can say, is as far as introductions to a story go, it is easily one of the best this franchise has had to kick off a game. In fact, I'd even go as far as to say the prologue was one of the best I've ever played. It was well written, there was real emotion, and the mocap was easily the best this franchise has ever had. The details of pores and skin texture were next level.
So
honestly, I don't
even
think
better than the earlier ones.
This good. But keep in mind that was just a prologue, and we all know Assassin's Creed prologues tend to be better than the actual story sometimes. Anyway, that's what I can say about that. So now let's move on to the story itself.
Y'all remember Revelations?
Spoilers, of course. So after the prologue, the preview did a bit of a jump in the story, and it put us in Harima, which I think is one of the first regions in the game. At this point, we already teamed up with Yasuke, and the preview event basically lets us explore and do our thing. Story-wise, we were only able to do a quest related to a masked man named the Noble, and I'll be honest with you, there were moments in this questline that hooked me. Some pretty entertaining characters, and seeing some of the cutscenes, which were really well acted, had me
this game looks
but
great.
At the same time, there were bits where it kind of felt like I was playing through an Assassin's Creed Odyssey inspired storyline. That said, I only got about an hour and a half of story time out of what's probably a 40 to 50 hour game, so it's just way too early to call it. It's like trying to judge a whole TV series based on the first episode of the first season. It's just not not
You
fair.
never know.
For
You never
context,
know,
the
though.
last time I thought Assassin's Creed had a great story was Origins 7 years ago. Before that, it was Assassin's Creed Black Flag 12 years ago. So yeah, story-wise, this franchise, in my opinion, has not really hit those highs in a while. I went into this preview event with low expectations, but based on what I played, there is real potential. I just wish I had more time to dive into it. But for now, that's all we got. Now, staying on the topic of the story,
I just like
do want to touch
the
upon
graphic,
the dialogue and
right?
some mocap as well. As I already said, the prologue was top-notch, and afterwards we skipped a lot of time to play in the region of Harima. Now, the questline in Harima had dialogue that seemed well written, so I will give it its flowers in that regard. I did like the dialogue and the cutscene quality. Some of the characters we encountered looked incredible. The voice acting was very good, so no complaints in that regard. The hair details and hair physics were top-notch, which actually surprised me quite a lot. The facial expressions seemed improved upon since Origins because, if you know, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Valhalla and Mirage has some pretty terrible facial expressions in dialogue, but with Shadows it was a step up. Of course, what you're seeing on
what was
screen
it in
is not
Mirage
even
that I
full
kept
mocap.
saying?
It's just in-game cutscenes, and if we compare it to a Valhalla cutscene, I mean it's night and day. My only downside
Day
is
and night.
probably Naoe and Yasuke's own facial expressions during
Toss a
specific
turn, I
dialogue
keep
moments.
stressing my
It really gave off a
mind.
soulless and lifeless vibe to it. They were even moving their arms, but then again, a few cutscenes later, it looks way better, so it's kind of confusing what's actually going on.
This-
To be
this
fair,
is-
this
remember,
is a
this
big
is-
open world RPG game, so I'm sure the price of
This is just the
mocapping
beginning.
every single piece of dialogue would be astronomical. And Ghost of Tsushima is in the exact same boat, where only important story moments were mocapped. Again, it's hard to talk about the story and dialogue without going into spoilers.
I have to finish my
just
Ghost of
take a look at this
Tsushima
guy. I simply
playthrough.
cannot explain this to you without
Yo, bro.
spoiling the story.
Yo, his cheeks was out. His cheeks
Now, I
was
do
out.
want to touch upon character switching, simply because this was something that a lot of people were curious about. I've seen people say, would it be like Grand Theft Auto 5, where they would switch characters and it's a bird's eye view from the top and it transitions into the other character? Well, let's just take away those Rockstar level expectations for just a second and settle down a bit. The character switching is pretty much nothing special, and I know that is quite disappointing. So pretty much you just go into your inventory and switch to either Yasuke or Naoe, and a loading screen happens and voila.
That loading
Honestly,
screen
it is
is
a
beautiful.
bit of a letdown that they did not do anything new or innovative with this feature. If anything, it's exactly like how it worked 9 years ago in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, maybe even less impressive, because at least in Syndicate, you'd see Evie or Jacob hanging out on the train when you switch characters. There was also the option to fast travel to a previously synchronized viewpoint and choose the other character, but that's pretty much the extent of it. Do note though,
Okay,
again,
that's
I only got
kinda-
to play about
it's
4
kinda,
hours, so maybe there's more
convenient.
to it later on. But from what I saw, it's just a very basic feature. The one nice thing though is that you can switch characters during a quest. For example, if you're playing as Yasuke and you finish a conversation where somebody tells you to investigate a spot, you can simply switch to Naoe and she'll take over from there. One thing to keep in mind, you cannot switch characters during combat, which is pretty self-explanatory. So, you know, don't go into a fight thinking you can tag in the other character, because that's not how it works. You can
Oh
also
my
approach
God.
viewpoints with Yasuke.
Why did
and
he
you will say
hit her
this.
like that?
Naoe could reach the top of that pagoda if she wanted a challenge.
And then we just switch to Naoe to synchronize the viewpoint. Overall, character switching is functional, but you know, it's nothing innovative or groundbreaking. It's just a very simple feature implemented into the game.
That doesn't make or break.
Something I found quite interesting when I was playing through the preview event was to do with the map size. I'm sure we've all seen what the map looks like based on promotional images and the recent exploration article going over in depth, but I was very surprised when experiencing it myself, because when looking at the map UI, it seems smaller than it is on screen, but that is not the case. It's actually quite big. I would guess that the map size in Assassin's Creed Shadows is slightly bigger than Origins, which I don't mind at all. The thing with Origins map is that while it was incredible, a lot of it was just desert, which made sense for the time period. So with Assassin's Creed Shadows having a similar map size, I'm really hoping there's more to see and do when I get to play the full game. Now do note that there was a border when I was trying to leave the Harima region, so we were restricted to only that part of the game world. So if you were hoping I'd travel across the map and show off all the environments, side quests, hideout and a lot more, unfortunately that just wasn't possible. Something I was able to discover during my 4 hours was painting with Yasuke and Naoe, where you can spot animals and paint them, which provided no gameplay value, but were peaceful nonetheless. There were shrines you could pray to, there were temples to discover,
Which provided
and
no
which I'll go over
gameplay
later
value.
on, and there were way more things that I couldn't get to. In terms of side quests, well, I didn't do any because remember, there was a border that restricted me from going outside a certain area. So again, I needed more than 4 hours to fully explore this game. But I did see some exclamation marks scattered across the map, and they do seem to be side quests.
This game is
or rather
gonna be
something important
massive.
given the context of how scattered they are. One thing that you can do in this game is swim, of course. Both Yasuke and Naoe can swim on water and underwater.
That's good.
I wasn't really a fan of how they kind of reused Valhalla's motions, which kind of felt cheap, especially with how fast both Naue and Yasuke can swim, which seems exaggerated as hell. I also explored the safe houses, or as they're known in Japanese, kakorega, which are scattered across the cities. I did talk about these in my exploration article video, but they are actually pretty cool. You can manage your recruits, I'll talk more about that when I cover combat. You can access your storage, you can browse contracts, which are
So it's bringing back like Brotherhood?
tasks for loot and resources, and you can refill your supplies. But just don't confuse these safe houses with the main hideout, which was not accessible during the preview. On top of that, there were vendors in the city who specialize in things like ornaments, gear, port trading, and other stuff. Now let's talk about the atmosphere in this game, because the atmosphere really impressed me. Some of the environments look incredible, even though I was playing it to a compressed remote application in 1080p. It still looked amazing. The forests are super dense, like seriously very dense. The rain is heavy, and I'm pretty sure ray tracing was on automatically because the puddles were reflecting beautifully. The wind was intense and actually worked well with the cloth physics, which is something that Assassin's Creed does really well. The port side of Harima was beautiful, especially during the day. One random thing I liked was how guards would tell you to put away your weapon, and I guess it's up to you if you want to listen.
And
you can pet cats, so that's always good to know, I guess.
They always do that and pet any cats.
Now, when it comes to the inventory and gear side of things, I do think this new system will be appreciated by a lot of people. But for those who are big fans of RPG games and prefer more quantity over quality for some strange reason, then it may be a bit of a downgrade to you. But I like it. First of all, the inventory has been revamped quite a bit. The UI and layout are totally different from any Assassin's Creed game we've seen before. But you can definitely spot some inspiration from Assassin's Creed Odyssey here. For example, you can view both Naue and Yasuke's inventory, kind of like how it worked in Syndicate. You've got your primary and secondary weapons, plus a slot for your horse. So yes, each character gets their own horse, which thinking of it now does make sense. And I like how the horses have a bit of a backstory to them. Little details like that are always
appreciated. But they already had a names,
your headgear, your armor, and a trinket / amulet slot. This basically acts as an accessory to give you further benefits in terms of stats, and you can buy them at vendors. For Yasuke's weapons, if you've been following the game's development, you'll already know what he can wield. There's the long katana, the naginata, the kanabo, the bow, and the teppo. You can mix it up however you want, melee and ranged, or even dual melee weapons. It's all based on your playstyle, which I think is pretty cool. And there is a decent variety too. Out of all of his weapons, my favorite one that I used in this preview event was the naginata, as it felt the most balanced. And for Naue's weapon, she has the katana, which is her signature weapon, the kusarigama, which is the chain sickle, and the tanto combined with a hidden blade. Now the RPG side of things, oh boy, weapons come in different rarities, which is pretty standard for RPGs as we know. But here's what I like. It's not overwhelming like Assassin's Creed Odyssey was, where you were completely flooded in gear. The weapons feel more intentional and handcrafted this time. One thing I do want to point out though is the weapon stats. They've gone full RPG here, with stuff like DPS, posture damage, ability damage, and crit percentages. I can see hardcore RPG fans loving this, but I also know some people that might find it a bit too much. Just something to keep in mind. What's cool is that every weapon has its own unique ability, and the same goes for headgear and armor too. They all come with different stats and passive abilities. For example, for one of Naue's katanas, she has an ability where she can create an AoE effect when attacking enemies right after dodging. And since this was a preview event, we did not get to experience the hideout, so as you can see here, you can get perks for your weapons, but of course that requires upgrading your forge at the hideout. So pretty much reminiscent of the system in Ravensthorpe in Valhalla. I do hope it's way more expanded upon than Ravensthorpe though. So yeah, overall, there's a lot of depth for the inventory. It's a perfect mix of simplicity, but also it still has that depth to it in certain areas, such as percentages and abilities. Now let's talk about what I think is the highlight of this entire 4-hour preview, and that is a combat system, which is pretty important in these types of games. Now before I give you my thoughts, I've got to say, I've always felt that Assassin's Creed combat has been one of the weaker aspects in the franchise. There's never really been a system that really blows you away or makes you want to master every mechanic, but I do genuinely believe with Assassin's Creed Shadows that changes. This is easily the most player focused, unforgiving and skill based, believe it or not, combat system in the series by far, which yes, it doesn't really say much when you look at the other games in the franchise. When I was fighting enemies in this game, I noticed that there was no more mashing buttons and expecting to breeze through fights like you could in the other games. This one actually requires skill for once, and I love it. Now don't get me wrong, it's not on the level of a Souls game or anything like that, but for an Assassin's Creed game, it is definitely more intense than what
it sounds like I actually gotta
so
like,
when Ubisoft said they were not going to hold your hand with this game, they were not exaggerating.
Actually
now the game does
fight.
give you a pretty easy to follow tutorial for all things, so it's not like they expect you to do everything at once. A lot of what I experienced in my preview was not as straightforward as I expected. You really have to think about parrying, dodging and so on, and that adds a whole new layer to a franchise that most of the time is lacking in combat. It's definitely a step up from what we've seen before. Now with that in mind, I want to talk about Naoe's combat first. So you know how the game presents Naoe as the stealth focused character and Yasuke as the combat focused character? Well, yeah, that means literally what they say. The difference in combat between Naoe and Yasuke is so noticeable, especially against the big enemies. You would often at times easily get 1 or 2 hit by big brute type enemies, and they can also shrug off her attacks quite easily, and she doesn't deal as much damage as Yasuke would, which is self-explanatory. I've always been somebody that said I'd play with Naoe all the time because she seems more fun, but during this preview event and the 4 hours I played, I started having second thoughts, and I realized just how important Yasuke is in this game for combat. The only big difference is Naoe is a lot more fast and can very easily dodge out attacks, whereas Yasuke, he's slower but deals a lot more damage. Another issue for Naoe is damage output. It did feel like enemies were very tanky, but not to the point where it was damage spongy and gimmicky. Instead, these enemies will parry, dodge and block a lot more, and they feel way more responsive, and that applies to any enemy, not just the harder ones. Now I played through the preview event on normal difficulty, and the enemies were very responsive, so just imagine it in nightmare difficulty or the hardest one. It would be a lot more of a challenge.
There's difficulties,
to me, Ubisoft
bro.
AI in enemies and NPCs are very lackluster, and that's been a thing for a long time. But you can tell the work has been put in for this game. A lot of past Assassin's Creed games would have groups attacking you one by one, and they look kind of lazy in design. Whereas when I was playing through this preview event, I noticed that enemies would not stand around, and instead a lot of the time they do come after you simultaneously, which I appreciate. Again, it really ties back to the whole no hand holding approach with this game, and honestly I'm here for it. I do think I'm a fan of how they've implemented the armor breaking system for enemies. So instead you're not attacking enemies and their health goes down. First you would need to break down their armor so it falls off.
So it's like you really gotta work.
Of course this only applies to the enemies with armor on, and then they would get stunned shortly after and give you the perfect window of opportunity to get some hits in. This feels more realistic and it's a welcome change that is definitely needed. Now one interesting thing that I noticed was how enemies can pick up things from the floor and toss them at you, which I thought was kind of funny. Kusarigama combat was probably my favorite weapon type so far from Naoe, as the AoE in her attacks helped quite a lot, especially because in this game you will get grouped on quite a lot. I will also say that I did have a lot of fun doing
why are you getting grouped on?
Or Tanto combat, which I am glad something like that returned for this game. That is quite literally how it feels to be a Shinobi. Very fast and executing swift strikes with a small blade. Now of course I'll go into the abilities and upgrades quite soon, but moving on from Naoe's combat, I feel like Yasuke's combat was an insane difference, and insane in a good way. You know, when it comes to straight up raw combat against any type of enemy, Yasuke absolutely shits on Naoe. The whole phrase pick on somebody your own size applies perfectly for Yasuke, as there are quite a lot of enemies that are Yasuke's size, which kind of surprised me. I do think Ubisoft slightly exaggerated the size of a lot of enemies in this game. But with Yasuke, his hits are more impactful, and he can wear down the health of enemies a lot more faster than Naoe. He can also tank a lot more hits, whereas with Naoe, she can literally get 1 or 2 hits. But Yasuke is a tank himself. Long Katana is probably the most efficient type of weapon for Yasuke for combat, as it fits the samurai character perfectly. But that Nagi Nata is the one weapon that I loved using the most. It's the most balanced in my opinion.
You're going to see a lot of variety.
It's a two-handed club, which does a lot more damage, but the only downside with that is that it's very slow. One weapon I find very overpowered, and I don't think I'll be using it that much because it just doesn't feel like the right game for it, is Yasuke's Teppo rifle, which shoots pretty hard. It's just not my type of weapon in an Assassin's Creed game. But again, it goes back to mixing and matching different primary and secondary weapons.
It all depends on what time period you're into.
Other combat system in the RPG Assassin's Creed games, because Assassin's Creed Shadows absolutely shits on them all. Now let's go over something called Mastery, which is essentially the skill tree or ability tree, but with a different type of name. This was something going in that I hoped would be changed quite a lot compared to past Assassin's Creed RPG games, and thankfully it was. Now how this works is through something called knowledge. So in this game, the way you gain new skills is by obtaining knowledge points, which can be done through many different activities like progressing to the main story, the open world like completing temples, forts and so on. The more knowledge points that you gain, the more access you get to new knowledge ranks. So as you can see, Naoe's mastery is unique to her, and Yasuke's is unique to his. With Naoe, you have 6 different branches to work towards. Her katana has its own mastery, her kusurigama, her tanto, her tools, her shinobi side of her character, and the assassin side of her character too, all of which can be upgraded. Now since this is just an impressions video, I don't want to go over every single node in this entire section, but instead just give my honest thoughts. Now I do like how streamlined this is. It's not at all complicated and a complete like whatever on earth Assassin's Creed Valhalla skill tree was, but it's more focused on catering to a specific playstyle that you want to go for. So for example, with Naoe's katana, her mastery basically means her level with the weapon. You can increase the damage of her katana by certain percentages the more you rank up your knowledge. I do like that compared to other past Assassin's Creed RPG games, they don't bombard you with so many different abilities, all of which would
That's
be
what I would
useless,
have to go through if I was to play the other ones.
For
Crazy
example,
word.
this one named Tidal Wave is a great skill I love to use in the preview. It pretty much is a very fast strike that deals 25% ability damage and it makes the enemy vulnerable. Aside from active abilities like that, there are passive ones too, such as being able to increase all melee weapons damage, a counter attack where you press RB or R1 after dodging, and there's even upgrades to active abilities. So
I wonder how the buttons are going to work. I might want to use square, you know?
For 2 attacks instead of 1. Basically, there's a lot to mess around with and it's very impressive. Literally everything I just said applies the same for the kusurigama and tanto as well, with how they also have unique active abilities and passive abilities too. I can see that a lot of people will like the system quite a lot, and I'm just glad it's not overwhelming and messy like past Assassin's Creed RPG games. There is actually some thought process going on here. Now one last thing I want to touch on is, remember when they said everything in the cinematic trailer can be performed in the actual game? Well, they weren't wrong, because if you remember at the end of that cinematic trailer, Naoe did this super fast dodge and then did a strike which looked pretty cool. Well, that ability in game I believe is called Shadow Barrage, where you can very quickly evade and get out of the way when getting hit. Pretty much identical to the trailer. Now in terms of Yasuke's mastery, it's also quite in depth like Naoe's, and it works the exact same way, except for his weapons instead. I will not spoil all of the skills you can use, but just know there are some very insane looking ones, and dare I say some that seemed very inspired by Assassin's Creed Valhalla. One thing that really stood out to me during the preview and honestly surprised me quite a bit was the variety in enemies and NPCs. Now I wasn't expecting anything innovative to be honest, but I didn't expect it to be this good. Take Assassin's Creed Odyssey for example. I don't know about you, but I remember almost every NPC and enemy looking pretty much the same. Maybe it was a development thing, or maybe Ubisoft just thought everybody in ancient Greece looked alike. Who knows? But in Assassin's Creed Shadows, the variety is on another level compared to the past Assassin's Creed games. Whether it was the big brute enemies, elite enemies, shinobis, guardians, regular foot soldiers, or even random NPCs walking around, they all feel more different and distinct. Of course, there are some repeats, that's just how RPGs are. It's impossible to make every single character in the game completely unique, but compared to previous games, there's definitely more effort here, and I really appreciate the attention to detail. Even the outfits stand out. NPCs have their own unique looks, and you'll notice little touches in their behavior too. Some of them interact with each other, others are sleeping on the ground, enemies sleep during the nights. You'll even see interactions like NPCs crying because their wagon crashed, and there are kids running around, pets, and it's just more diverse overall.
So they really was doing a big one,
because this is not a dense city setting. It's feudal Japan with an open world, but for what it is, it feels like a proper next-gen experience. And honestly, after playing the preview, I understand why they were not releasing it on PlayStation 4 or Xbox One. This game just has those level of details that consoles like that would not be able to handle well. Of course,
oh my god,
but, we know how that turned out.
Yasuke.
I do want to touch upon some of the types of enemies I noticed, such as elites and guardians, because my god, these guys are literal giants of enemies. Unity was able to has those level of details that consoles like that would not be able to handle well. Of course, Unity was able to, but we know how that turned out. I do want to touch upon some of the types of enemies I noticed, such as elites and guardians, because my god, these guys are literal giants. They are hard to take down depending on your difficulty, and their attacks hit very hard. They dodge to perfection, they parry, and their AI is just smart for once. So yeah, I do think Ubisoft cooked in terms of this aspect. Now let's go over Shinobi recruits, which are basically recruits similar to Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Assassin's Creed 3, and maybe Assassin's Creed Odyssey with that recruit system too. But since we only had 4 hours of playtime in this preview, we couldn't really take advantage of this system or get a very good understanding of it. However, there are 2 Shinobi recruits named Yaya and Yagaro who you can call into combat, and I was surprised. Yaya, the fat one, is quite efficient and can hold his own. I mean, he was beating the living shit out of elite enemies with just his fists, which I thought was kind of funny but also strange, seeing as Naoe deals less damage with a blade. The other recruit I didn't get to use because I just forgot, but I can only assume assume he's just as good, as he's capable of taking out enemies who have 3 bars of health or less. You can also upgrade these recruits and unlock their passive abilities, which adds on to this system. Now, of course, since I assume Shinobi recruits will be story related or have their personal stories to them, they will not die, but instead once they reach low health, they will just pull back and run off into the distance. So yeah, I am looking forward to exploring the Shinobi system quite a lot more once the full game releases, because I can tell it will be quite in depth, especially considering there are 6 of them in the game, with their own names, backstories and maybe personal stories to them. But again, 4 hours is all we had, so this feature couldn't be explored any more in depth. Now let's talk about stealth, which is another feature just like combat that stands out in this game. In the 4 hours that I played, I did not get a ton of chances to dive into full-on stealth missions. There were maybe 1 or 2 moments, mostly in the prologue. But here's the good news. Stealth in this game works very well. The pro mechanic is super underrated, and I can see a lot of players pulling off some crazy stealth runs with it, especially when you're hiding in tall grass. Oh, and for those wondering, yes, you can whistle to lure enemies. I know a lot of people are asking about that, so there you go. That said, the removal of social stealth, like blending into crowds, sitting on benches and hiding in plain sight, is definitely a big loss. Those features made stealth feel more dynamic in the older games, and I do think it's something that this game could have benefited from. Still, the tools that you're given for stealth are pretty solid. The smoke bomb is super handy, just toss one and the enemy turn into sitting ducks, letting you pick them up one by one. The shuriken and throwing knives are great too, especially for breaking light sources and taking out enemies from a distance. And yes, hiding in the shadows is a thing, and it works surprisingly well. I thought that it might be a bit clunky, but it was actually done really well in the preview I played. One thing I did notice was the level designers put a lot of explosive barrels around the place, because my god, you can dash a throwing knife at one and the explosion radius is so massive to the point where it can take out a group of enemies, all of which makes you remain hidden. That said, I did not get to experience stealth as much as I would have liked to in the 4 hour time frame. There wasn't really a ton of stealth opportunities, so I'll definitely need more time with the full game to really see how it holds up. But so far it does seem quite functional.
But wait, so like, I wonder how it would work where like if somebody was to come by there.
Parkour at the same level as the older games, which are my favorite types of parkour, with consistent side ejects, back ejects, vaulting, smooth descending and stuff like that, then lower those expectations quite a lot. Parkour in Assassin's Creed Shadows is basically a better version of the RPG parkour style that we've experienced in the past 5 games. This game's focus is clearly on a big open world with spaced out buildings, especially in the cities.
Guess I'm gonna have to get used to it, guys.
Which was just the Harima region. There were pretty much no parkour routes, but honestly I kind of expected this. The franchise isn't about single city environments anymore, where you can parkour from one end to the other. From what I could test out, Yasuke is able to parkour, or rather climb and jump, but he's incredibly slow at it, like painfully slow. It takes him 2 seconds to climb up something, but he struggles to reach certain ledges, and the funniest part, his weight actually breaks tightropes, so he can't even walk across them. Now on top of that, he couldn't climb up some of the viewpoints to synchronize, so I had to switch to Naue. And speaking of Naue, she is much better at parkour. Well, the
of course, what you expect?
Parkour, that is. She's insanely fast on the ground. Definitely the fastest assassin we've seen running wise. So yeah, Basim's fastest assassin title is definitely out the window. She can climb vertical walls very quickly, and she's capable of side and back ejects. But again, the environment doesn't really let her show it off much. There just isn't enough areas built for parkour in the traditional sense. She can also manually backflip descend, so that's not automatic, thankfully. She can do this pretty cool backflip eject off a wall. So yeah, it's very hard to talk about parkour in a game like this because it's not the focus anymore. Honestly, if you want a more detailed breakdown of parkour mechanics for this game in a preview, then I'd recommend checking out Robotopoulos or Leo K's preview videos. They're way more in tune with every little parkour detail. From my perspective as somebody that loves the Ezio trilogy parkour, this is nowhere near that level. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I do think the days of that style of parkour are long gone. Oh, and one thing that really annoyed me was, remember the fall damage negation from Assassin's Creed Odyssey? Well, yeah, it's back. There's an ability that lets Naue completely negate fall damage, and I hated it. It ruins the immersion, the realism, and the whole assassin fantasy vibe going on. So yeah, out of combat, stealth, and parkour, parkour is definitely the weakest link here. It's functional, don't get me wrong, but it's just not the same anymore. I want to touch on the season system, because even though this was just one region we were able to play in, I did notice that when I opened the map whilst exploring, the option to change season was available to me, and when I did, it played this kind of environmental cutscene, and then it changed season. Now seeing as this is definitely not a late game thing because of where the preview takes us after the prologue, it does appear that you can change seasons on the go, and I am not a fan of this at all, because that defeats the whole purpose of a season system. If we have the power to change from autumn to winter and so on, then that just breaks the flow of the game. Personally, this should have been a late game thing, and only available after you have finished the game, and not available to you near the start of the game. But again, as I've said many times. I played a 4-hour preview where a lot of things were unlocked to me. So maybe
And then
this
there's
secret system
also
was unlocked
this
to me
was
as well.
the
And
alpha
perhaps
for
this is
like
a late game thing
November,
that the developers
so
threw into this preview
you never
for
know
us
what's
to
going
try.
to change within the next 2 months or a month and some change.
Now the last thing I want to touch upon is the loading screen. So if you recall games like Assassin's Creed Origins, Valhalla and Mirage, you're able to walk around in the loading screen. Well, the same goes for Shadows. Of course, in those other games you had kind of an anime simulation of what's going on based on the game, and for Shadows it's quite strange, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. It's pretty much like sakura trees or some kind of trees just there with distant mountains in the back. I mean, it does look very pretty, I won't lie, but if you're calling this game the next generation
definitely
of
looks
Assassin's Creed,
crisp.
I would prefer something different if I'm being honest. Now don't get me wrong, I do like the loading screens in those 3 games I mentioned as they offer interactivity while waiting, but you know, I just don't know what I expected, to be honest. Maybe I'm just nitpicking at this point, but I am somebody that wants to see this franchise evolve in every aspect. So
Okay.
yeah, that's what
Look
the
at the
loading screen looks
parkour,
like
huh?
for Assassin's Creed
I mean,
Shadows.
As somebody who's currently playing through
Now,
the
I
SEO
saved this part
trilogy,
for last because it's a big deal,
you know?
and that is the Animus Hub. I've been so curious about this for a while, and I'm honestly surprised. We've speculated for so long about what it could be like, and now we finally know. If you don't know, the Animus Hub is basically the new modern day setup for the series. It's a launcher for the recent Assassin's Creed games, but it's way more than that. So now when you launch Assassin's Creed Shadows, this is what you'll be presented with: memories, projects, exchange, and vault. Now memories is another word for the launcher, and here is where we're going to boot up whatever Assassin's Creed game we want, or at least that's what I thought. It turns out the Animus Hub only works with the newer games, so that means Origins, Odyssey, Valhalla, Mirage and now Shadows. I do have to say, it looks really well designed, way better than I expected. It does not feel half-baked.
nah, y'all gonna have to add the old ones,
now,
bro.
projects are basically regular release gameplay missions for Assassin's Creed Shadows named Anomalies. Completing these gets you in-game rewards like new weapons, gear, data files, whatever that means, and keys. And those keys are for the next part: the exchange. Now the exchange is kind of like your daily or weekly shop we've seen before, just like Reader's Shop in Valhalla. Here you can trade keys for weapons, gear, mount cosmetics, and they've teased that there's more to come. Pretty straightforward. Now the part that I'm the most excited about, the vault. This is basically what the modern day story is going to become. They've hinted that there is a lot to explore here, especially if you're into the modern day side of the series like I am. It sounds like this is where we're going to get deeper story reveals, and I can't wait to see
But can
more
we
of what
play
they have
through them
planned.
though?
They've said the vault will evolve over time, and there is still a lot we don't know about it. Now, when does this release? Well, the Animus Hub launches with Shadows, and it's set to grow over the next few months and even years. It's clear that this is the future of Assassin's Creed. I'm just very curious to see how it plays out.
Facts.
And that brings me to the end of my impressions after playing Assassin's Creed Shadows for 4 hours. What do I think? I think I need more than 4 hours to judge this game.
Big
It's just
facts.
too big of a game for just 4 hours. But
Big
from
facts.
the preview I did play, I enjoyed it quite a lot. I do think the story has mad potential. The mocap is improved massively. The combat is easily the highlight of this entire preview. And I can tell that the open world aside from the Harima region will be massive and enjoyable. I can already tell that when the game comes out, it will be way better than the 4 hours I played. There is still that Assassin's Creed jank in some parts like swimming, horse riding, some dialogue and some quest structures.
Can't beat
and I do
that,
think
man.
some improvements can be made. So yeah. Oh, and also do remember that I played through a remote desktop application and it was
True.
a work in progress build. So yeah, if you
True.
did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date on everything Assassin's Creed. And with all of that said, I will see you in the next one.
Sir, hidden one. Y'all don't already, go follow that, man. Leave your likes, your opinions, your comments, your subscriptions, all on this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend. Share your thoughts. Be nice about it. Until next time. Sayonara. Signing off.
Yo, go follow Tastic. Go follow Tastic's Twitch, cuz. That man is crazy.